Hello, everybody. Good to be here on my last Sunday of being with you at Kingston Back Pews, Southmore. It's sad. I've had a great 4.5 years. My last talk is 3 parts. The first part is what I'm going to do now, which is how reliable are the Gospels? How can we be sure that they can be trusted? But before I start on that, I just want to encourage you that God can use you. I think the only ability we need for God to use us is availability. The next time you feel that God can't use you, just remember, Noah got drunk. Abraham was too old. Methuselah was way too old. Isaac was a daydreamer. Jacob was a liar. Leah wasn't pretty. Joseph was abused. Moses had a stuttering problem. Gideon was afraid. Rahab was a prostitute. Jeremiah and Timothy were too young. David had an affair and was a murderer. Jonah ran from God. Naomi was a widow. John the Baptist ate bugs. Peter denied Jesus. The disciples fell asleep when praying. Martha was a workaholic. The Samaritan woman was divorced more than once. Zacchaeus was too short. Timothy had an ulcer, and Lazarus was dead. God can use us no matter what difficulties may be. Anyway, on to the talk. How reliable are the Gospels? Well, we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospel writers. Matthew, also known as Levi, and John were actually disciples of Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector and the most infamous character next to Judas. John was a brother of James, son of Zebedee. Mark, also known as John Mark, was a companion of Paul. Papias, in AD 125, confirmed Mark had carefully and accurately recorded eyewitness accounts from Peter. Luke, who travelled with Paul, was known as Paul's beloved doctor. The first thing to say is that the Gospels are not like modern day biographies, which give us intimate details of the person's life, and different stages of that person's life tend to be spread equally through the book to give a telling of their life. But Mark, for example, only records Jesus' adult life, doesn't mention his birth at all. So Jesus' adult life from age 30 to 33. And half of Mark's material is on the last week of Jesus' life. Why is it that short period? There are 2 reasons. First is literary. In the ancient world, the only reason for recording somebody's life was if they did something from which there were lessons to be learned. So biographies tended to dwell on the things in people's lives that were excellent. And the second reason is theological. The main point of Jesus' life was that he died, he was buried, and he rose again. I'll be looking at those in parts 2 and 3. Now, the standard scholarly dating of the Gospels is Mark AD 70, Matthew and Luke AD 80, and John AD 90. So, all written within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. There were obviously antagonistic witnesses around who could have spoke out if these teachings and evidence was false that was being spread. I want to contrast that time period with the 2 earliest biographies of Alexander the Great. They were written more than 400 years after his death. Historians agree that they were reliable. So if the Gospels are written 30 to 60 years after Jesus' death, that is small by comparison of the 400 years. Actually, there's a strong case that Gospels were actually written earlier than the standard dating. Acts was written before Paul was executed, so no later than AD 62. Acts is a second part of Luke's work, Luke's gospel being the first one. So Luke must have been written before that. Since Luke incorporates some of Mark's material, Mark wrote no later than AD 60, possibly late AD 50s. If Jesus died between age 30, AD 30 to 33, that's a maximum gap of 30 years. Paul's major letters appeared during the AD 50s. He used famous creeds such as Philippians 2, 6 to 11 and Colossians 1, 15 to 20. These are incredibly significant in explaining what early Christians believed. If we look at another creed, possibly the earliest one, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 8, we know that Paul was converted about AD 32. So he first met with the disciples in Jerusalem around AD 35. At some point between these dates, Paul was given the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. In it, there are facts about Jesus' death for our sins and his resurrection appearances. A good case can be made that evidence for Christian belief in the resurrection, though not actually written down, was actually established within 2 years of that event. 2 years is very significant compared with 500 years that is generally acceptable for other historical data. What about passing on the information, the eyewitness accounts and so on? There were no computers. What about books? Well, there were no books. There were scrolls, but they were rare. It was an oral culture. It was all done by word of mouth. Rabbis actually became famous for having memorized the whole of the Old Testament. Another interesting fact is that studies of ancient Middle East have found that anywhere between 10% and 40% of the retelling of events could vary, but there were always fixed points that were unaltered. That is interesting because it's between 10 and 20 and 40% is the consistent amount of variation among the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on any given passage. If the gospels had been identical word for word, it would have raised charges of conspiracy. Simon Greenleaf from the Harvard Law School, after studying the 4 gospels, says this: there is enough discrepancy to show that there could be no previous concert between them, and at the same time such substantial agreement to show that they were all independent narrators of the same great transaction. Craig Blomberg is one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospels. He says that within the last 100 years, archaeology has repeatedly unearthed discoveries confirming specific references in the Gospels. These show that the Gospel writers were concerned with giving accurate information. I'll give 5 quick examples. In Luke 3:1, Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene, is mentioned. An inscription has been found about him. In the healing of Bartimaeus, Luke tells us that Jesus was going into Jericho. Mark tells us that he was coming out. What about that? Well, archaeology has found that Jericho was spread over 4 different sites about a quarter of a mile apart. So in other words, a town spread out. So Jesus could have been going into Jericho and leaving Jericho at the same time. In John 5, there are 5 colonnades mentioned. These have been unearthed by archaeology. In Luke 2, the famous Christmas parable, Quirinius was governor of Syria. Coins with Quirinius have been found. Did you know that Nazareth is not mentioned in the Old Testament or by Josephus, the famous Jewish historian? But in 1962, evidence was excavated that Nazareth, and in 2006, 2 houses were found. It's been estimated that the population of Nazareth at the time of Jesus was about 500. What about evidence from non-Christian sources that Jesus lived? Josephus, a Jewish historian, mentions Jesus a lot. He mentions Jesus' surprising feats, he calls it, his miracles, his crucifixion by Pilate, his resurrection, among other things. Tacitus, a Roman historian who is an important, unsympathetic witness, writes about the success and spread of Christianity based on Jesus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Pliny, a Roman in AD 111, writes about Jesus. Thallus, a Greek in AD 52, mentions the darkness that is recorded in the Gospels when Jesus dies on the cross. The Talmud, an important Jewish writing, completed around AD 500, mentions Jesus as a healer and a miracle worker. There's ample stacks of historical data that Jesus existed. No serious person can doubt that Jesus existed in 1st century AD. The main question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And that is the question we will move on to in part 2. Thanks for listening. God bless.